Hello, we're on the air. Welcome to the Petrarch Institute. I'm here. I'm the Alexander Rosenthal, the founder and the co-founder and director of the Petrarch Institute. Here once again with my friend, colleague, and co-founder, Dr. Miles Smith. Say hello, Miles.
Hello, everyone. We're delighted to have you back with us once again. You're joining us on our ongoing series in Golden Age video installments, meaning the highlights of civilization. We've been following an arc recently, which took us from the Greek and the Roman world through what we now call, at least retrospectively, the Middle Ages. And in those videos, if you watch them, you'll see some reasons why we see them as an age that can be considered in their own right and not as being between one thing and another. But today, I think, Alex, unless I am very much mistaken, we move to the thing that comes after the in-between, after the Middle Ages, the much-storied Renaissance. And I guess as the Petrarch Institute, this is a period and a cultural moment that's really formative for the way we approach education and our work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Many of the concepts that about education and so forth that we use at the Petrarch Institute, and of course, Petrarch's considered the founder of Renaissance humanism, are derived from this epoch. So it's obviously an era which is of particular importance to us and to those of you who are interested in classical learning and so forth. So what we're going to do, we're going to take this in two installments. The first one, because the Italian Renaissance is a large theme. So the first installment will be on just the concept of humanism. I'll introduce the concept of the Renaissance and talk a little bit about the history, but basically we'll just focus on the idea of humanism. What was it? What were the central figures? Why is it important? And then in the next installment, we'll talk about political thought and art during the Renaissance. Political thought meaning largely Machiavelli. And of course, I think what the Renaissance is most immediately known by to many people would be things like the great explosion of artistic creativity with figures like Michelangelo and Raphael and countless others. Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, one could go on and on and on with sort of the explosion of artistic creativity. And I think that deserves a separate treatment. Let's see. So I think probably we should get started with just explaining what the Renaissance is and a little bit about the historical context for the shift that historians discuss between the medieval and the Renaissance world. Does that sound like a good place to start, Miles?
Absolutely. It's a good way to define what's distinctive about something people talk about a lot, but they don't necessarily have in their mind as a clear reality defined by principles.
Yeah. No, so, one thing which is kind of curious is it seems that the idea of the Renaissance didn't really come into widespread usage, at least, until the 19th century Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt, who wrote a book called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And this is when sort of, I would say, the Renaissance really became a topic of distinctive historical and cultural study. With Burckhardt, I think one of the complexities about the Renaissance is how to understand or define it, right? Is it an extension of the Middle Ages? Is it the beginning of modernity? And so there's that complexity. Jakob Burckhardt really emphasizes the Renaissance as a break from the past. He refers in particular, the concept that's very associated with him is this idea of the discovery of the individual, right, as being one of the central themes of the Renaissance. And if you remember from our discussion in the Middle Ages, one could see that in the sense that in the Middle Ages, people still very much thought of themselves as as defining their identities from within various communities, whether it was the community of their city, self-governing community of the city, of their guild, of their estate. Are you noble, clergy, or commoner? All these sorts of communities were largely where people had their definition. And so he attributes this idea of the individual, which is, of course, one of the central themes of modernity, as something that really developed during the Renaissance. We're not talking about primarily a political individualism, such as you get in the 17th and 18th centuries with the rise of liberalism, but a kind of ideal of self-development or personal development. So we're talking really about the consciousness of the individual. That's sort of what he emphasizes. Now, on the contrary, a very important Renaissance scholar of the 20th century, Christaller, emphasizes the idea that we've gone too far with this, and that really the Renaissance, the claim for the originality of the Renaissance is somewhat overstated, and that it's really a kind of late medieval period, and that many of the things that we saw when we were discussing the Middle Ages, for example, the revival of interest in ancient learning, we saw very clearly, I think, in the case of the Middle Ages, that had already been going on, certainly by the 12th and 13th centuries, with the recovery of Aristotle. So I think probably the best way to approach the Renaissance is as its own thing, right? Not to try to look at it either from the standpoint of modernity or from the standpoint of it being simply an adjunct of the Middle Ages, but just trying to get at what it was, right? What was going on, what made it different. And of course, the center of the Renaissance world would be Italy. So I'll just say a few things about sort of the political and social environment of Renaissance Italy, starting by about 1350. Does that sound like a good way to go there, Mas?
Absolutely.
Okay, so remember that those of you who'd watched the one we did on the Middle Ages may recall that I discussed by the High Middle Ages you have this development of urban life, right? So the Middle Ages was defined largely by a feudal structure, a feudal agrarian structure, which was based on the relationship between large landowning nobility and let's say knights or soldiers who would serve them in exchange for fiefs, right? Parts of the land which they would hold a kind of tenancy over, as well as the relationship to the peasantry, which was in much of the Middle Ages largely bound to the land, right? But what you get by the time of the High Middle Ages is the restoration of urban life and the free self-governing cities, which are a sort of new way of organizing things, distinct from the feudal system. By the time we get to Italy in the 14th century or so, in the 1300s, I think we can clearly say that we're moving into very much a post-feudal epoch, which is highly urbanized. And what is driving that is largely trade, right? The Italian cities, like Venice and Florence and so forth, controlled much of the trade going on in the Mediterranean, for example, with the Byzantine world and elsewhere. And large amounts of money were coming in. And so what you get by the 14th century is this kind of post-feudal world. But politically, Italy is a very complex patchwork, okay? We can think of it like this, okay? So there's a southern part of Italy, the kingdom of the two Sicilies, which eventually becomes part of the Spanish Empire through Aragon. Then there's the middle part, which is overwhelmingly dominated by the Pope and the Papal States, who themselves will later become one of the principal patrons of the Renaissance, right? And the popes are very much part of the political structure of Renaissance Italy in terms of being Renaissance princes with their own territory and armies and so forth, right? And they control the middle part of Italy. And then the north is this very complex world of city-states and other areas, right? So you have the Duchy of Milan, right, for example. But then you have also areas like Venice and Florence, which no longer are really governed according to the model of noble noblemen ruling, but have become, Florence in particular is sort of the center of republicanism, right? You have this revival of the republican form, which is really the extreme development of we talked about the guild system and the role that the guilds played, right? And so they have a system of a republic. It's not an absolute democracy where everybody had equal play. The major guilds had the largest role, and then you had the minor guilds, and they elected a figure called the Gon Polaniere of justice, right? But it was a republican system based on civic participation. And this is important for a number of issues, not least because the ancient virtues and practices, such as rhetoric, suddenly assume relevance in this republican world, right? You know, the art of speaking persuasively, for example, was very important, I think, as we saw with the Greeks and the Romans, but it becomes important and in the Middle Ages, rhetoric sunk to becoming more like something preparatory within the liberal arts training. But now suddenly it became something very relevant. Another thing which is going on are the rise of important families, some of them not necessarily coming from the nobility, like the Medici, who started as wool merchants and bankers, right? So you have this rising commercial class, and they, together with the nobility, and this is something I find remarkable in history when I look at politics today. Cultural patronage becomes centrally important to their competition, right? So you look at Florence, you had these families that they called signori, right? The great men, the big families, like you have the Pazzi Chapel and the Medici Chapel. You have this sort of competition to build churches, to patronize art, to fund academies for letters, all these sorts of things going on among the signori. And another thing which is going on is, you know, in the Middle Ages, you had the feudal bond being very important. You know, the bond of loyalty and honor between, say, the knight and the noble lord. Now you're getting the rise of the condottieri, who are essentially mercenaries. Right, and that's being the source of armies, right? You know, pay because it's a money economy, right? It's no longer, you know, the feudal economy was in some sense a result of the decline of money following the fall of the Roman Empire. You have the rise of a money economy and professional soldiery, who themselves play a very central role. An additional thing that's important to understand is that the Byzantine Empire is now in its last legs. You've had this continuous fighting since the 11th century between Turkic groups like the Seljuks and later the Ottomans, the Osmans, and they're conquering slowly the Byzantine Empire. And as this is happening, you're getting some movement of Byzantine scholars of Greek into Italy, where, as it happens, there's a great revival of interest in the classics. And this is the moment where the Greek language revives its knowledge in the West, right? To the Romans, you know, the Roman educated elites were bilingual, Latin and Greek. Now you have the revival of Greek in the West itself, in the Latin world. And this goes hand in hand with great movements of translation. It's at this time, for example, all the works of Plato get translated. Suddenly this whole world of Greek thought, which had been closed except for what was translated into Latin, is now open to scholars. So you can imagine this as a world which is extraordinarily vibrant, culturally, economically, which is also divided, right? And thus there's a lot of conflict and tumult, but also a world of tremendous intellectual adventure and excitement, which I think really furnishes the background to the rise of humanism. So do you have any thoughts or comments, Miles, on that before I go on to defining humanism and its key attributes?
Maybe just a quick question, because you talked about the rhetoric, you talked about the rediscovery of Roman and Greek or Athenian ideas, and although it's a bit of a stretch, I mean, because you have change that's driven on the one hand by advances of trade or commercial and political development, and on the other hand, a kind of new ferment of ideas and styles. Is there anything that can be said just for the general audience as a kind of snapshot to compare, Roman Renaissance city of this time with Athens or Rome? I mean, is there a useful comparison or contrast that helps us understand what's in common and what's different or distinctive?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Christopher Dawson talks about the fact that you have the rebirth of the polis effectively in the Renaissance, right? So you have, for the first time since the Roman Republic, let's say, a kind of civic republicanism where, for example, the skills of rhetoric and persuasion become not just useful as sort of a preparatory liberal art to something like the study of theology, as in the Middle Ages, but something practically useful. And that's, I think, something to understand, that at this time, humanism, which is the recovery of the ancients, was something seen as very practical. As Christella points out, Latin was, whether it's commerce or law or whatever, the knowledge of Latin and being able to use Latin effectively was a very practical skill, right? As practical as using English in today's commercial market or something like that, right? So I think that is something very important. So I think we are seeing the recreation in many respects. I mean, it's very logical that they were going back to look at the classical examples of the ancient polis and of the Roman Republic for guidance in the sort of what's called civic humanism, which I'll discuss a little. Another thing that I think is important is the rise of the lay estate, we could call it. People sometimes go too far and think of the Renaissance as sort of the Enlightenment before its time, meaning a kind of secular age. That's not really true, and scholars have pretty well debunked that. But what is true, if we mean by secularism that people who are not monks and priests are sort of coming into their own as an educated class who have their own interests and activities, which are not necessarily centered on withdrawal from the world into monastic study and prayer, right? But who have lives which are of exploration, of trade, of commerce, of law, of political engagement. In that sense, we can talk about a kind of secularization in the literal sense of the saeculum, the temporal world, right? It's getting more emphasis, and the lay people are becoming, we're getting a literate class of lay persons, right? Whereas in much of the Middle Ages, one would be relying on monks and friars, even to perform sometimes functions of government that required literacy, right? So this is, I think, an important element, and this is probably fueled to a large degree by the combination of an urban and commercial transformation that's going on. So does that help at all, Miles?
Yeah, I think that paints it helpful.
Okay, so what I will do next is discuss some of the key attributes of humanism, just so that we can define it to some degree and understand what exactly it is. So, I mean, one of the things is that humanism then, as now, can give rise to certain kinds of confusions about what it is all about. Maybe a good place to start would be Aulus Gellius, who was a Roman writer. Because we might think today, I think of humanism as either, we sometimes think of secular humanism, sometimes it's confused with humanitarianism, right? We have a lot of ideas about humanism where we're not quite sure when one uses the term what it means, right? So this was, Aulus Gellius was discussing the meaning of the term humanitas, right? In his work, The Attic Nights. He was a Roman figure. And he wrote, "Those who have spoken Latin and have used the language correctly do not give to the word humanitas the meaning which it is commonly thought to have, namely what the Greeks call philanthropia, signifying a kind of friendly spirit and good feeling toward all men without distinction." I think that's quite similar to our term humanitarianism, right? But they gave to humanitas about the force of the Greek paideia, That is what we call education and training in the liberal arts. Those who earnestly desire and seek after these are the most highly humanized, for the pursuit of that kind of knowledge and the training given by it have been granted to man alone of all the animals, and for that reason it is termed humanitas, or humanity, right? So it's this idea of the study of the Greek and Roman classics for the purpose of the full development of human intellectual, aesthetic, and moral attributes. Right? So a key aspect is going to be the recovery of antiquity. And this is why it's called the Renaissance, rebirth, right? The rebirth of antiquity on Greek and Roman models. So we have during the Renaissance the revival of Greek as a language of study in the Latin West, as well as an increasing movement toward classical standards of Latin, right? In other words, so for example, Cicero and Virgil and these figures become sort of standards. Now, an aspect of this is, which is associated with Leonardo Bruni, although he was not the first to mention it, is this idea of the studia humanitatis, the humane studies, let's say, right? Which have similarities, which we'll talk about with the medieval liberal arts, the medieval trivium, but also a few differences, right? So the studio, if you remember, the trivium was grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And as we've discussed, rhetoric takes a kind of primacy during the Renaissance because it's something politically and socially useful, whereas the logic, which was emphasized by the scholastics, becomes of lesser importance. The studio humanitatis consisted of five humane studies, let's say. Grammar, which meant basically the acquisition of the knowledge of Latin and Greek. Poetry, rhetoric, history, and philosophy, particularly moral philosophy. And it's worth looking at what was in the studia humanitatis, which was not in the medieval trivium. So one is grammar. Well, grammar was in both. But there's a great emphasis, as we discussed, on sort of philology, in the Renaissance, in terms of there's a revival of Greek and an emphasis on Latin forms, as well as an interest in just the structure of words, right? And so then there's poetry. So we see that one aspect of the Renaissance is that the aesthetic aspects of Greece and Rome, which tended to be neglected during the Middle Ages, now get a great emphasis, right? The importance of beauty, which I think is something which people associate naturally with the Renaissance. History, I think, is very important. There is now a sense of history which goes together with the interest in language. So, for example, Lorenzo Valla disproves there was something called the donation of Constantine, which was the basis for much of the post-temporal power, the belief that Constantine had granted lands and power to the popes. Based on this document called the Donation of Constantine, Valla, who was himself a priest, by the way, proved that it was a forgery based upon the use of terms that were not existent. So there's this idea of historical sensibility, which is kind of new to the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, if you depicted Achilles, he would look like a medieval knight kind of thing, right? So this idea of the sense of history was, I think, very important to the Renaissance. And two other aspects of the studio humanitatis. One would be, so they're no longer merely propedeutic to professional studies like theology or law or medicine, but become to some degree viewed as important in themselves, as well as for their use. And another natural thing would be if you are studying the humanities in and of themselves and not merely for the sake of theology or so forth, as would have been general in the Middle Ages, there's obviously a greater importance given to human things, to the human realm. So, in terms of the ends of the humanist education, Cardinal Sadoleto, who himself wrote an important work on humanism, divided the purpose of education, of humanist education, into two, the moral and the literary. And he says, moral training sets out with the object of ensuring that all our words of actions may be marked by moderation and may keep a fit and proper rule of conduct, the correct beauty of which may delight not only the mind of the learned, but even the eyes of the ignorant. But then he goes on to say about literary education, we receive from nature that which is central in ourselves, what indeed makes us truly and individually what we are. Truly and individually is an important term, but in a rough and unfinished form. It is the function of letters to bring this out to its highest perfection and to work out in it a beauty comparable to the divine original. So it's this idea that a humanist education gives a person full development of human faculties, right, of their moral excellences as well as their intellectual excellences, and that the fully developed human being will be the one who is also most useful in all kinds of practical tasks as well. Another element of humanism is what is called civic humanism, which we can contrast with the monastic ideal of the Middle Ages. Right. So in civic humanism, we have the ideal of the active life. You could say that in the Middle Ages, the emphasis was on the contemplative life. Here we have the active life, eloquentia, eloquence, as well as wisdom and virtues. Right. These were the things that were strongly emphasized during the Renaissance. And so we have Rumi saying that the glory of man lies in activity. And it seems very clearly, if you look at the whole modern age, we see European civilization engaged in frenetic activity, whether it's the activity of exploration, the activity of commerce, the activity of technological development, the activity of arts and sciences. So there's a great development of activity. And finally, we have this idea of the universal, well, I shouldn't say finally, there's one more thing I want to say after this. The idea of the universal man, the Uomo universale, which I think we've already touched on. It's this idea of the full-sided development of all aspects of the human being, intellectual, aesthetic, physical, even moral, right? So that a person will not be a specialist, but will rather, be skillful in really as many things as possible, right? And will be able at least to apply his developed intellect and mind to as many things as possible. Now, another thing that I think that's already coming through about humanism is this idea of the dignity of man, right? Key central theme. In fact, the title of Pico della Mirandola, the great Renaissance humanist work, was De Hominis Dignitate, right? Which is really a kind of manifesto of the Renaissance, right? Concerning concerning the dignity of man, or concerning human dignity, right? So, one thing that's important is that the various streams are coming together. So we have the Greek and Roman humanism, but it's also integrating itself with the Catholic culture, right? And so it's important to realize also that there's a tremendous Catholic influence on the Renaissance, not only in the sense that the Catholic Church was a direct patron of Renaissance art and Renaissance humanism, and a number of the popes were themselves humanists, scholars, but also in the sense that the ideas included an important Catholic influence. So here's a line from Pico della Mirandola that I think we can think of as almost a kind of, in its vision of human possibilities, is almost a kind of a manifesto, really. It's been called a manifesto of the Renaissance. So this is what he says. He's speaking in the person of God to man, right, in this line. So he says, in this passage, he says, you with no limit or no bound may choose for yourself the limits and bounds of your nature. We have placed you at the world's center so that you may survey everything else in the world. We have made you neither of heavenly nor of earthly stuff, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with free choice and dignity you may fashion yourself into whatever form you choose. To you is granted the power of degrading yourself into the lower forms of life, the beasts. And to you is granted the power, contained in your intellect and judgment, to be reborn into the higher forms, the divine. Imagine the great generosity of God, the happiness of man. To man it is allowed to be whatever he chooses to be, right? So that this idea that man is sort of the microcosm, that everything in the cosmos as created by God has a fixed place except man, who was created in freedom to be what he chooses to be, whether better or worse, right? I mean, he can lower himself to below the level of the beast in some ways through wickedness, or to elevate himself to something which is like the image of God. And so this idea of imago Dei, of the image of God, is also very important in the Renaissance. And I think we can see that the elements of Christianity, however, that are emphasized are not so much the humility and the sinful dimensions of human existence, but this idea of human dignity, human freedom, and so forth. So that seems to be what was getting emphasized. And in the synthesis with Greek and Roman culture, we have what I think would be certainly a rather interesting development of civilization. So do you have any thoughts or comments, Mas?
Maybe just a quick question on behalf of anyone in the audience who's interested in the relationship between philosophy and the sort of social and cultural and ultimately political trends that we're seeing here. When you talk about the promotion of rhetoric and perhaps in a sense the demotion of logic, when you talk about the rise of a historical perspective and the focus on eloquence in language, persuasion and rhetoric, is there a sense in which that is tied to the emergence of nominalism or voluntarism in philosophy as, you know, scholasticism matures through this period?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't have like an immediate answer. I think that in general there was a reaction against nominalism in the sense that scholasticism in its nominalist phase was seen to become logic chopping. This was sort of the stereotype of the humanists. And so there was a reaction against that. In terms of philosophy, the single strongest innovation, or in terms of philosophy, the strongest element that comes through would be Platonism, because Plato is for the first time known in full, for the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, known in full. And so there's a very strong Platonist emphasis, a very strong interest in Socrates and Plato, which I'll discuss in a moment. The other thing is the philosophy that the humanists are mostly interested in. If you look at the medieval scholastics, they're very interested in problems of logic and problems of metaphysics, right? Because metaphysics was seen as useful to theology, right? Defining the divine being and how it differs from creaturely being and these sorts of things. The overwhelming philosophical emphasis is moral philosophy, the virtues. So this would be what would belong to a humanist education, would be the study of the virtues in particular, and less sort of metaphysical issues like the study of being and the study and so on. So that's what I would say would be the trend. I think so a lot of times when they state the studium humanitatis, they speak of moral philosophy rather than philosophy in general. So is that helpful at all?
It is, because I think it speaks to maybe the ascent of will at somewhat at the expense of reason. You know, for example, in Occam, in the changing the way logic is seen, and even in the way God's liberty is described, you see a bit of a movement to the open liberty of God's will apart from His reasonableness, and that seems to jibe with Pico de Mirandola talking about man setting his own boundaries. Right? It almost seems to work theologically from the top down. As God becomes more voluntarist, so does man, and so does the
Yes, I think in Pico de Mirandola, you're definitely seeing the idea that human freedom is the most distinguishing element. In Pico de Mirandola, I wouldn't want to generalize to the whole Renaissance, because Platonism also has a strong intellectualist bias, but in Pico de Mirandola specifically, the emphasis on freedom and liberty, which I think is a very central idea in modernity generally, right? I mean, is given an emphasis, whereas Thomas Aquinas, for example, would have emphasized man's reason, right? Man's the image of God is basically the human intellect. But I mean, it's not a. I mean, one would not. What Pico de Mirandula is saying is that man's position is not fixed. He doesn't have his position automatically, right, in virtue of his creation. Rather, in some sense, man can ascend or descend in the order of being, right? So we can become more wicked than the beasts, or we can realize the image of God in us. And that's sort of the Christian aspect, because obviously he would like to see our freedom used to develop our likeness to God rather than to develop our Luciferian side. Does that make some sense?
Absolutely. Very helpful.
Okay, yeah. So, I thought, so the other thing that I was going to do was just mention some of the key figures in the history of humanism. We have, the first would be Petrarch. I think Agricola said that all the erudition of our century is owed, right, to Petrarch. So he's really the founder of humanism. And if you look at a Victorian scholar, Richard Claverhouse Jebb, he writes about Petrarch. He says that great movement, he's talking about humanism, in which he was a pioneer, and which we call the Renaissance, had its central inspiration in the belief that the classical literatures, which were being gradually recovered, were the supreme products of the human mind, that they were the best means of self-culture, that they alone could see the human reason moving freely. So there's reason. Moving freely, the moral nature clearly expressed. In a word, the dignity of man as a rational being fully displayed. All this is implied in humanism. Petrarch's ideal of humanism as a discipline that aims at drawing out all the mental and moral faculties of man pervades the whole course of the Italian Renaissance. So we can say that Petrarch is, in a sense, the founding father of the Renaissance and its outlook, right? So as you might expect, he acquires a great passion for the classics and a sense of the greatness of their achievement, and also crucially the belief that that greatness could be recovered. So he was a poet. He was the poet laureate of Rome. So just in the development of the Tuscan language alone, Petrarch is one of the most important figures in his work Canzoniere, some of which includes letters to sort of his lady love Laura. So we have kind of this influence of courtly love. And he talks about the Triumphi in another set of his poetry of love, the victory of love, chastity, death, fame, time, and ultimately eternity, which is to say of divinity. Right, this would be his poetry. He also wrote Latin poetry, Africa, which was about the Punic Wars, which is probably a rare interest in the 14th century, right, which is a rather early period. And basically, more broadly, I think we could say that for Petrarch, these two figures were his constant guides, and he even sort of wrote to them. He actually wrote letters to Cicero on the one hand, sort of a symbol, I would say, in some sense, of the active life that was emphasized in the classical world, and Augustine, who was the model of the life of contemplative leisure in the most exalted sense of that term. And these two things are sort of, and the sort of tension between them is sort of a constant theme in his writing. He writes De Vita Solitaria. I can switch to humanist classical pronunciation now that we're in the Renaissance. De Vita Solitaria, which is, about the solitary life. So we have this issue is very big for him, the issue of the active and the contemplative. He discovers, he's a collector of classical works. He discovers Cicero's letter to Atticus, which is about the liberal arts, which is also kind of a charter of the Renaissance. And so he's generally, in that sense, considered the first big figure of Italian humanism. And of course, there's also his friend, Boccaccio, who is the author of one of the chief literary works, if not the chief literary work of the Italian Renaissance, the Decameron, right, which is basically set in a frame story of people during the Black Death, discussing stories during a 10-day period, right, and one of the most famous works of Boccaccio is also a great promoter of humanism. We also need to discuss the Renaissance court schools, which are beginning to turn humanism into a curriculum. By the way, a curriculum which pretty well became the dominant form of higher Western education up until the early 20th century, right? So there's something that gradually spread. The Renaissance court schools, you have figures like Vittorino de Feltro, who taught young pupils. It was called, I believe, La Giocosa, like a joyful place, where he emphasized joy as well as the study of humane learning, as well as the Catholic faith. And many children, for instance, sent their children to him. But very importantly, for those who think that humanism is this extremely elitist in a narrow sense thing, right? Poor children who showed signs of interest and talent, he allowed in free, basically, right? So it was not based like on a so much on caste as sort of a combination of talent. I mean, certainly if you were a child of a prince, you could get into school, but if you show talent, regardless of your social status, you could also acquire a learning humanist education, which I think is very important because you see a number of people during the Renaissance and early modern period who came from rather humble origins who end up becoming important figures. So this is the Renaissance schools. Then you have the rise of the chancellors of Florence, Salutate, Chancellor of Florence, who invites in a figure by the name of Chrysoloras from the Byzantine Empire and establishes one of the first schools of Greek in Italy. And he's encouraging the collection of ancient manuscripts. So this is important. The political class sees humanism and culture as one of its most important, its patronage as one of its most important functions or contributions. And the same we could say about the next chancellor, Leonardo Bruni, who wrote the Historiarum Florentini and wrote a translation of Aristotle. So he is writing a history of Florence, right? And we're having this ideal of Florence as sort of the resurrected world of antiquity, right? With all of its talents and so forth. Lorenzo Valla, who I had mentioned in the early 15th century, for his disproof of the donation of Constantine and this new historical philological sensibility, also writes the Elegantiae Linguae Latinae, which celebrates the classical model for Latin, which ends up getting adopted, by the way, by the church during that period. The Ciceronian Latin becomes kind of the standard. Now, I can't believe I didn't actually bring them up, I don't think yet, but extremely important. Actually, I did bring them up, so I'm okay. The Medici, right? So, Cosimo de' Medici, although he shied away from formal things, became, gradually in the course of the 15th century, becomes sort of the unofficial leader. As the head of a big banking family, becomes sort of the unofficial leader of Florence. He is a major patron of arts and letters. Artists like Brunelleschi and Donatello, which, the building of the Duomo of Florence, which was hugely important. Michelozzo, right? There are libraries that are established under his son Lorenzo de' Medici. You have the Laurentian Library of Antiquities in Florence. And very important, you have the birth of the Florentine Academy, which was basically the main figure here would be Marsilius Ficino, although other figures like Gemistus Platon of the Byzantine world again, were also involved. I believe Pico della Miranda Michelangelo, Leon Battista Alberti, all these famous figures in the history of humanism were involved in the Florentine Academy, and they were basically kind of a reading group in some sense. They gathered for discussions and writings and translations. So all the works of Plato, which had been inaccessible, were now translated into Latin. And Ficino's main interest was showing the deep kinship between, basically doing for Plato what Aquinas had done with Aristotle, right? Trying to integrate Platonism with Catholicism. And there's a lot in Plato where you can see a kinship, right? So, I mean, this was a passage from the Phaedo. It says, Plato writes, but when the soul inquires alone by itself, it departs into the realm of the pure, the everlasting, the immortal, and the changeless. And being akin to these, it dwells always with them. Whenever it is by itself and not hindered, and it has rest from its wanderings, and remains always the same and unchanging with the changeless. And then he goes on, and this state of the soul is called wisdom. So we have in Platonism the idea of the immortal soul, the idea also of reward and punishment after death, and the idea of the ascent of the soul from the changing to the unchanged, to the eternal. And one of the key things about Ficino was the importance he gave to beauty, which is derived in part from the Symposium of Plato, which talks about the movement from sensible beauty to intelligible beauty. And the idea that the world of the senses, the beauty of the world of the senses, is something which is meant to guide the soul by means of eros, or love, toward the eternal and divine beauty. And this was an idea, by the way, that had a huge influence on Renaissance art. For example, Michelangelo, the young Michelangelo, would have been hearing these discussions by Ficino and so on, right? And, whereas Ficino wrote, we would never know the goodness hidden away in the inner nature of things, nor desired it, unless we were led to it by its manifestations in exterior appearance, right? It's the idea that the beauty of external things can lead us toward eternal beauty. Michelangelo would write, good painting is nothing else but a copy of the perfections of God, and a reminder of his painting, right? So Michelangelo was very influenced by this Neoplatonic idea. And we have also Leon Battista Alberti, who probably could transition into the arts because he wrote a lot about painting and perspective and poetry and scholarship, classical scholarship and architecture, the designer of the facade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. So he is another one of these figures who is one of these Renaissance men, literally, in being a man of many talents. Worth mentioning Lorenzo de' Medici, of course, who was the critical patron during the High Renaissance, at various points of Sandro Botticelli, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. We won't get too much into art. It was also a rough and tumble figure of these Renaissance signori. So this Pazzi family, which I had mentioned, tried basically to knock him and his brother off on Christmas Day during Mass. His brother was stabbed to death, but he survived. And then one of Leonardo da Vinci's paintings shows one of the members of the Pazzi conspiracy hanging from a lamppost subsequently. So it gives you also a sense of the Renaissance was not all kindness and light. The last thing I should mention would be the revolution of manners, right? So if you remember what we were talking about in the Middle Ages, there was a chivalric ideal of the nobleman as a warrior arising. But here we have a mixture of humanism and a new ideal of etiquette rising around the courts. There was a figure in Urbino, Federico de Montefeltro, who was himself a great connoisseur and patron of the arts, Urbino. And one of the people who knew him, Castiglione, writes a book called Il Cortigiano, the Courtier, which provides the ideal for the courtier of this time, that he should be knowledgeable in martial arts, that he should know Greek and Latin, that he should be adept at dancing and music and painting, that he should be knowledgeable in courtesy and the pleasantries of court. And so we have a transformation of manners from the somewhat, we would say, from today's point of view, brutish manners of much of the medieval world to sort of the refined manners that one would associate with early modern European courts. And Castiglione's book became one of the most widely translated and read books in the early modern epoch. So this is another contribution of the Renaissance, would be the transformation of manners, and also that's important, these forms of etiquette and protocol for the development of diplomacy, which the Italian Renaissance was very important for, right? The protocols of embassies and diplomats to this day really go back to this epoch. So I think in terms of letters, I probably covered enough for today. Do you have any thoughts, questions, comments, or ideas that you wanted to bring up, Miles?
Maybe very quickly, a very last question, last word for me. This is very much a focus on the Italian Renaissance. Are there things elsewhere in Northern Europe, elsewhere in Europe, that reflect or extend on or contribute to all this that we should capture very quickly?
So I should have mentioned this earlier. I would like to do, after we finish the Italian Renaissance, I would like to do something on the Northern Renaissance. Because there was a Northern Renaissance, basically humanism spread from Italy to become a pan-European movement. But I would say that the main line of movement was from Italy north. In other words, the revival of classical humanism was something which affected Northern Europe and other parts of Europe, like France and Spain and so forth, through contact with the Italian humanists. So it really begins here in Italy through influences, of course, with the Byzantines, but we're going to see that, if we look at, say, the Shakespearean world or the world of Cervantes in Spain and so forth, right, that all of this is the spread of humanism through the continent. So I think that pretty well covers it. I'm glad that you joined us for today. And we're going to pick up next time with Renaissance art and politics.